All right, we're recording. Cool. Okay, so we're just going to continue on here, doing it, just hopping right back into it. There's a lot of material to go through. So in the last one, we went over the skeptical mind and how that's another discrepancy for consciousness or self-consciousness. And well, we're just going to sort of finish through that, and then we're going to be continuing on to the unhappy consciousness here in a moment. So anyways, continuing on here, this dialectic we see present here in self-consciousness through skepticism is the same that was seen in sense certainty, perception, and also Lord and bondsmanship. Except now that with skepticism, we have raised this dialectical movement to notion or to thought, proper to a self-conscious thinking subject. Skepticism is the logical conclusion that arose from the prior stages. The denial of otherness or taking the other to be unessential, recall the denial at first of the matters or qualia of objects as unessential that later became essential in perception, is seen fully alive with the skeptic mind, which now takes otherness as something to be actively negated, and it raises these things to notions, or to notion, I should say, which in doing so, and thus negating them without producing something positive on the other end, leaves us with empty thinking or lifeless thinking, and that it is incomplete, and we are left bereft of content by virtue of this negation, so our notions become void. So, a couple things here. Essentially, what's happening here with skepticism is once again that sort of thing that we saw with the Lord, in that the Lord wants to deny his necessary relation to otherness, in particular the bondsman. The skeptical mind also wants to deny its relation to otherness, and in a more active sense, so to speak. It's it's not just merely being indifferent to otherness, ignoring it. It's saying, no, I'm present in everything that's around me, and I'm not going to be skeptical against myself, but I'm going to undermine everything else outside myself and question it and sort of maybe not say it doesn't exist, but at least say put themselves first in terms, or at least presuppose themselves as having primacy, uh, and in having primacy, also sort of being a given, so to speak. You kind of think of maybe like how a lot of empiricists don't really ever question uh, the mind doing the empirical thinking. A lot of them take it for granted. It's almost like a given for them, so to speak. So that's one way of looking at it. It's a disharmony that he's pointing out here in terms of thinking. But the difference between the skeptic and the Lord, so to speak, is that the skeptic is almost an epistemological primacy, where he's putting the certainty of himself over otherness, and that's why Hegel says rather that it's sort of a notional form of discrepancy, which was different from like a more social relational form of discrepancy, which is worth noting because, as we saw in the last episode, we've sort of at this point self-consciousness has kind of come into contact with notional thinking in a true sense, once it's kind of graduated, so to speak, to skeptical thinking or thinking through ideas to a certain degree. So anyway, I'm just going to move on to this right here. Since skepticism is by nature the negative undermining of otherness without moving toward positive content, it therefore threatens its relationship to this objective reality and its active undermining of it. The skeptical consciousness, in its denial of otherness and its belief that any difference that it has is this is a pretty bad typo, that any difference that it has, its existence in another, in the sense it has its existence for the skeptical mind, just undermine it. Okay. Yeah, I completely messed that up. Basically, what I was trying to say there was that for the skeptic, otherness is it's just there to be undermined for the skeptic. That's the only purpose it serves. which is why it takes it to be unessential, so to speak. Um, but this is a problem because the skeptical mind, in order to be the skeptical mind, requires its relation to otherness to be skeptical toward. But of course, it doesn't recognize this. It sort of ignores that. But in doing so, he doesn't realize that in constantly undermining that which he is contingent on, he is also undermining himself, so to speak. So that's also that's kind of he's kind of hinting at the beginning of, once again, the necessity of relation, um, which is something to an extremely important thing to take note of. Let's see here. It sets otherness up as something to be negated. Otherness, which appears immutable at first, is negated for the skeptical mind, and it takes the objective as something which vanishes before it. Everything must be undermined, and this is the sophistry of skeptical consciousness. It takes pride in denial, but never does the work of affirmation in a positive respect. It merely says, quote, is not, but never is. And in doing this, it is simply a purely negative thinking. Its essence is to negate all things from itself. In its act of undermining, it realizes itself as free and raises this to its own notion of or understanding of self. However, this attitude will soon turn inward once denial of the outward becomes redundant for it. So basically, this kind of thinking is, the discrepancy that Hegel would be pointing out is just the fact that um, you can't simply negate everything while ignoring predication. Like you can't actually have one without the other logically. But of course, the skeptical mind doesn't want to admit that. It wants to just sort of take itself. I mean, implicitly, it knows this too, right? Because in saying "I am that which negates," it is affirming its existence. So it's become, at this point, it's not skeptical toward itself. But once it's so skeptical towards otherness and is constantly undermining the veracity of the world around itself, it'll become sort of redundant. It'll look elsewhere to negate, which will just end up being itself. Now, this kind of reminds me of like, I forget where this actually might be another Nietzsche quote, but I could be wrong. But basically, those that like to declare war or something along those lines, those that like to destroy, once they've destroyed everything else except themselves, they will just end up destroying themselves because there's nothing left to destroy but themselves. It's sort of a similar movement or principle here at play with the skeptical consciousness. Um, so, anyway, when this skeptical self consciousness has negated the world outside itself, it does not know that its own identity was contingent on this world to which it is skeptical of. As it raises itself above the world of the unessential and takes itself as freedom through denial or its own negativity to be essential, its structure runs into an issue, and that it itself is conditioned by the unessential for its own identity as the essential. Or rather, its freedom that it takes to be essential exists by virtue of what it has been denying this entire time, the world outside itself. If its identity is conditioned by what has no reality for it, then its identity is called into question, and therefore the skeptical consciousness is thrust into confusion. So basically, this is kind of just what I was saying before. If the skeptical consciousness needs otherness to be skeptical, but part of its essence as being skeptical is to deny otherness, undermine it, and take itself as prime, uh, it runs into a contradiction. It's basically trying to destroy the conditions for its own existence. I like to think of it this way: um, if if I define myself as that which destroys everything around me, um, it ends up becoming self-refuting or self-negating at a certain point because if I end up destroying everything around me, there will be nothing left for me to have my essence as that which destroys everything around me, so to speak, because there won't be anything around me to destroy once I've destroyed all of it. And if that's the case, then my essence would also collapse because what it is contingent upon has been destroyed, no longer exists. It's a very similar thing here with skeptical consciousness. Even though it wants to deny otherness. It needs otherness for its own existence, but it doesn't recognize that. It is once again the sort of same idea of primacy without the recognition of its relational nature that is also a necessary part of its existence. Um, and this is just the same pattern we keep seeing at different levels of consciousness. So skeptical consciousness exists whilst affirming things, even though it would deny this. And this is also important. It wants to deny that it's affirming things, but in denying things, you are also affirming something. You are affirming that you are denying it at the very least. Um, it goes through the world as a self-contradictory consciousness. It wants to take itself as unified consciousness, but then it also sees that it exists through this unstable world, taken to be unessential, and in turn, it holds two opposing views: that it is an unchangeable self, but also a self immersed within this world of change, which too is subject to it. This, in a way, brings itself back to a unity in the sense that it can see itself as a subject being thrashed around in this rather unstable process. Of course, this unity is not a strong one and severely flawed, and that it is still purely negative. It sees itself unified as the negator, but this eventually loses its grip on structurally because it will deny itself again by virtue of its nature. Nonetheless, because it does have to affirm things, it will deny them as well, and it can never resolve the fact it denies itself only to affirm once more with denial just around the corner as its own nature. It truly does live a life of denial in the sense that it wants to deny everything but also affirms things, and then has to deny its own affirmations if it is to remain skeptical. In the end, we are left with two poles that can never be brought together. It wants to be a stable self, but also denies itself. But in denying itself, it reaffirms something. But since its essence is to negate, it will negate this affirmation as well. It must, as that is what it is to be the skeptic who simply destroys. So there's a couple things going on here. The skeptical consciousness at a certain point begins to realize that it does affirm its own identity as a positive consciousness that is doing the undermining. But then it sort of runs into this issue where, okay, well, there's a unity of the self, right? There is me that exists beyond every point of my existence. That's the unchangeable self. Um, but then there is the sort of like concrete and the unchangeable self. I guess people would refer to this as like an abstraction, right? Because you can never get yourself as such. When you say, let's say John exists and he lives for like 80 years, you know, there is John that exists as a unified, essence beyond every year of his life. But that's almost an abstraction, so to speak, that unchangeable sort of Johnness. The concrete reality of John is, his sort of existence in what we would call the physical and temporal world, in instances, in location, and that's the changeable self, the self that exists through time and space. And the unchangeable self is just your identity as such outside of the particular instances in time and space. You may Hegel, of course, isn't a Platonist. He doesn't believe in a world of you know two different worlds of the unchangeable and changeable in the way Plato would. But like to help people understand, I guess you could view it as like the Platonic form and like the concrete imperfect reality almost. But that's bringing in transcendence, and Hegel believes in immanence. So these two worlds are just sort of logically one with each other. They're not, distinct. And that, for him, that's the work of our understanding, abstracting that truth. But so that's one thing to consider, that the skeptical consciousness does have to affirm something. But also, the skeptical consciousness, it's like, it's not, because we are talking about a subject, right? It's not purely skeptical. It does hold positions. It's a good example of this. I'm sure, maybe some of you guys have watched like new atheist debates. And a lot of new atheists will say, well, atheism isn't a worldview. It's just a lack of belief, right? This is like exactly what Hegel is talking about. It's like, well, but your lack of belief in one direction implies belief in another direction. If you say, for instance, there is, God, I don't believe in God, you're essentially saying, well, what you do believe in is a world that doesn't necessitate God at the very least, or a world in which God is an unintelligible thing. Like it is, you are positing something, you are affirming something in your denial at the same time. Um, so and of course, what they would reply to this is they would say, "Well, no, I'm not saying that either. I'm not saying anything." Right? They just want to deny. They never want to actually posit a belief. But and that's sort of what Hegel is talking about here. He's saying, well, uh, as soon as they get an inkling of themselves affirming something, they immediately seek to deny it. Um, and they will just keep doing this and doing this and doing this. But this is so it lives this weird. Well, he calls it a life of denial, like literally that in the sense of like they don't want to affirm anything, but you can't escape affirmation. That's the problem, and we're going to see this here in a moment. Uh, of course. Well, let me just see if there's anything else I missed here that I should go over. No, okay, I'm pretty sure I got everything here. But essentially, he's kind of highlighting the logical discrepancy that's occurring. Um, the pure sort of emphasis on negation without realizing you can't negate without actual concrete positivity. Um, so, of course, if this was told to skeptical consciousness, it would contradict this. And if you held the position that that was the opposite side of this contradiction, or in other words, what would appear to be the correct position, skeptical consciousness would deny that too. And um, like a child, it contradicts for its own sake, and in doing so, it will contradict itself by its desire to contradict always. If you say A, it will say not A, and if you say not A, it will say A, and by virtue of contradicting you, it has contradicted itself. And this is Hegel actually does use that analogy that it is sort of like a babbling child. It is a very immature consciousness. I'm sure like if any of you have like uh ever interacted with like a toddler in your life and like they ask you something and you give them an answer, they
Why?
yeah, exactly. They like to do that. Or they will just like to like toddlers are kind of like rage baiters in a certain sense. They just like to pick everything apart. They do. It's kind of funny. They do have a sort of level of skeptical consciousness, um, in that regard. You see, almost. I don't want to go off on new atheists so much, but they do have a sort of like childlike disposition to them, right? They're sort of like, no, 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 like they just want to deny everything because in their denial, they sort of get a reassurance of themselves, a reaffirmation of their ego, because in doing so, it gives them it's once again this desire for self certainty, saying, uh, not this, me, basically. Um, and that's sort of I'm reading a psychology into it that Hegel isn't, but
It's actually satanic. It's Luciferian.
well, it is Lucifer. You could say that because right because
Yeah.
Lucifer wants to say, well, not God, not the essential, but me, the unessential, created thing. So, uh, and that's the attitude, more or less. Anyway, continuing on here, skeptical consciousness is truly contradictory internally since it oscillates between this affirmation of things and its undermining. And of course, both are necessary for skepticism. It must have its object of denial, and this finds its end within its own self. In Stoicism, the denial of otherness was passive. In skepticism, is this denial made actual? And yeah, I was kind of talking about that before. There's a difference Hegel's pointing out between sort of passive indifference and active denial. Um, it's a good example is like maybe there's somebody you don't really care about that's trying to communicate with you. You just kind of ignore them, brush them off. Maybe you don't even realize you're doing it because you don't care that much. There's a difference between that and then like telling the person to go get lost because you don't like them. One is passive, one is active, pushing away from yourself. Um,
One is what a woman does to you. One is what a man does to you.
yeah, exactly. I'm sure some of the people here, you know, are in e-girls DMs getting left on red. That's not a dig.
Yeah.
that's not about what you sent me today. That's just a general pattern.
Of course, of
You
course.
know, well, it's like the jester meme, right? You know, in the sort of what's the gif where like the jester is dancing in front of the void.
In front of
Uh,
a queen,
the queen. Sorry, I shouldn't have used the
uh,
F word like that.
wearing a
Um,
crown.
but you know, what do you see? What do you see in that relation? You see recognition, and then the and a lack of recognition in the other. You see one putting primacy of themselves over the other in that relation.
It's the lord and bondsman,
Yeah, exactly. It is. Uh,
or lady and bondsman in this case.
yeah. You know, if you told them that, it would be, you know, they'd flip out. But that's neither here nor there. Um,
Yes, so like the queen in the dancing jester gif is actually she's like has like an inferior consciousness because she doesn't realize that her royalty is dependent on the jester
yeah, exactly. That's
and
the
like the
thing, right?
relation.
They don't understand that like their sort of value is only a value that exists by virtue of the recognition of those who see the value in them. But you know, and that's why you know they love to say, "I don't do it for no man. I do it for myself." It's like that's not true. Everybody does things for other people and for recognition. It's like human nature. But anyway, um, that's the chud reading of Hegel for you. Um, continuing on here, so an active which gave the living reality of self consciousness freedom, true expression. So what he means by that is essentially that like when passive indifference becomes active or actual denial, it's more expressive, it's more explicit at this point, and that's what skeptical consciousness is. However, self consciousness begins to realize that it has within its skeptical shape this internal division and that this inner contradiction needs to be resolved. And we see here that the duality that was seen in the Lord and bondsman is duplicated, but instead of an external relation between two self consciousnesses, it's a relation between two aspects of a single self consciousness. Therefore, it is a duplication of self consciousness within itself as a result of the contradiction of the skeptic's affirmation and denial of his own inwardness. The affirmation and denial are properties of self-consciousness, not yet unified, and this discrepancy gives rise to the next shape of self-consciousness, the unhappy consciousness, or the consciousness seeking unity for its own discrepancy. The unhappy consciousness seeks to resolve this disruption within itself by gazing outwardly into another self-consciousness and returning back to itself through this other. Similar to how recognition was needed at the earlier phases of self consciousness, self consciousness now seeks to get its unity by reaching toward another through which it can come back to itself. This is not yet fully realized, but it is the nature of the notion and of the natural unity of spirit to move outwardly and back to itself. Since spirit is a unity, this movement outward is a self externalization, uh, but that is realized at later stages of spirit. Okay, so couple subtle but very important things. And if anybody is watching these episodes and reading the text, I should also mention it's very important. You're going to want to read these paragraphs over like more than once. Like when I'm analyzing these paragraphs, a single paragraph may take 20 minutes of analysis because there's little like nuggets of wisdom in there that are like not something you want to miss because they're going to be pivotal for the rest of your understanding of everything else. And so an example of this is, you know, here he's relating multiple things. First of all, after skepticism, I kind of alluded to this before. Skepticism is done denying the world outside itself because it gets bored, it becomes redundant. But it then begins to sort of aim its skepticism toward itself because once it's destroyed everything else around it, it's only left with itself as the only affirmation that it's affirmed this whole time. But then because it still maintains this attitude of denial and undermining, it then applies this attitude to itself in the sort of realization that, well, wait a second, there's a unity of selfhood of that I have, but my actual concrete existence is this sort of uh, existence through time where there's a bunch of different me's, a plethora of experiences that are all distinct from one another. These are different selves almost in a certain sense. But also I do know that I am one person, right? It's kind of sort of the thing where it's like, well, am I the same Gabriel that I was yesterday? Well, yes, because I am a unified person, but also me yesterday, me today are two distinct people in a way because we're existing in two different locations and times. Um, and so that it begins to sort of it starts to ask this question, well, hold on a second, am I actually a unified single self? The unity of self through time and space is what it begins to question. So at first, it's sort of the way it tries to affirm itself again to escape this is to say, well, I know I'm an independent uh, real self because I see myself present through the recognition of another self consciousness. Um, and I can get myself back. But that doesn't actually solve the issue because then, you're sort of, well, one, the skeptical mind can try to deny that self consciousness maybe. And secondly, in receiving the I again, you just kind of return back to the problem. Okay, well, I know that I have a unity of self, but it doesn't, my concrete experience isn't this unity as such. It's maybe just a unity in moments, but never like the essence beyond all those moments is unapproachable. It's like Hegel would say, sort of an abstraction of the understanding. So it's basically it's having almost like an existential crisis in a literal sense, in the sense that it can't reconcile this unchangeable essence, this unchangeable unity with its concrete expression in the world of substance, or what we would call concrete reality, where it is constantly undergoing change and distinction from itself, of itself through time. It becomes anxious almost, and that's why it's the unhappy consciousness, because it can never it's being thrown around. It can't harness itself, so to speak. So, and there's a split, right? A split between the unchangeable and the changeable, and we'll see that right here. Uh, the split within the unhappy consciousness is a split between the unchangeable and the changeable, or the essential and the unessential. The essential being the infinite unity of self, and that unessential being those aspects of the self which are different from one another and come and go through life. The unhappy consciousness identifies with this unessential aspect. The reason it identifies with this is because it is the aspect that is immediately present to consciousness. It knows that it has a unified self, but it only experiences itself in manifold form through moments and periods, never as a static self as such. Hence, the identification with the unessential, yet does seek to resolve this split. In some sense, this division creates a constant chasing for the unhappy consciousness, in that it is constantly trying to halt this instability by tracing the essence of its unessential aspect. This split, it should be said, is not so much a choice, but an intuition based off the experience of being the quote I or self, which is existing through life at different points, distinct from another, but also is a real unity of self underlying all those distinct points of self. It wants to reach that unity, but never can because consciousness is evanescent and end in flux, so it can never grasp its own essential nature, even though it must exist for it to be the I, which has the property of existing at different points. It sees, therefore, its unchangeable side as something alien from itself, because it is not immediately there with it in life, which is where the unessential changeable flux of self resides. So it seems a little counterintuitive because you might say, well, why wouldn't it identify with itself, like its unity of self, if it knows it exists or senses it exists? Well, what Hegel means by identified is not it's not a conscious choice. It's that its intuition, its sort of sense of itself is this unchangeable aspect, because it can't actually sense itself as such. It can only sense itself in this plethora of distinct moments. Um, but it considers that plethora the unessential, the sort of contingent expression of its identity through space and time, through flux. Whereas the essential aspect is just the identity itself, the unity of self that does sort of express itself, like the universal self that's expressing itself in particular instances through um, time. But it doesn't identify with that unchangeable aspect because its concrete existence isn't that aspect. It's this reality of manifold externalization. Um, so in a sort of weird sense, it's alienated from itself in that regard. It's basically saying to itself, if we could personify this experience, okay, I know well, I'll use myself. There's Gabriel. He's one person that's existed for 23 years. Um, but clearly me at 6 years old is not me at 23 years old, and but like I know there's something there that's the same throughout all of this, but I can't actually grab that. I can't, that's not tangible. The only thing that's tangible for me is this sort of experience of myself through change. But that's not what I am as such. But I know this, but I can't grab it. It's outside of me. It's foreign to me in a certain concrete, immediate sense. And because of this, I am left in this sort of unhappy sense of self, a alienated uh, version of myself. But this alienation is paradoxically an alienation from my own self that I know exists and must exist, that I can never actually almost justify in a certain sense at this point. And that's what he's getting at. So this is why it pushes itself outwardly and has its essence outside itself. But this division is taken as a division within the unity of the unhappy consciousness, and therefore the division is necessary and essential. It views the essential element of itself as alien, and hence it identifies with that unessential. It does not yet realize the two are one and are thus both equally essential. It treats the unessential as an enemy. It wants to grasp itself as such, that is there undergoing all that change, but it cannot. In raising itself away from that unessential aspect, it can only move toward that which it considered, I should say, or that what it considered alien, which was the essential aspect. But it here also does not understand that the denial of that unessential aspect does not lead to a real unity, because the fixation on the essential strips it away from its concrete being through which movement, and leads again uh, to a sort of indifference to otherness that does not actually tarry with it. The only way to unify the split is to see both as essential and complementary to one another. The unessential is the essential way in which the unity of the unchangeable lives itself. This is not yet known, of course. The very act of identifying with the unchangeable reinforces the nature of the changeable, in the sense that one is universal and the other individual, and that you are the universal, uh, and the universal, I should say, is to individualize the universal. So the reaffirmation of the unessential is implicit in its denial, in the sense of individuating yourself as universal. Is still an individuation, and is still a particular, and it is the essence of that essential aspect to never be experienced as such. So it sounds more complicated than it really is. Basically, at a certain point, the unhappy consciousness, because it wants to actually grasp itself, its essence as such, it starts to begin to sort of like deny its, okay, well, the unessential expression of myself through concrete reality, through time, the different me's that exist between moments and days and months and years, uh, through which there is like this single sense of self transcending all those particular instances, which is the real me. I'm going to kind of throw that stuff away so I can get to the unchangeable core of myself. But this is sort of just it's once again the opposite side of this discrepancy. It doesn't realize that, well, wait a second, the essence of that unchangeable aspect is to manifest itself through change. Because to be a universal, right, which is what it is to be a universal beyond all particulars, or to be that which expresses itself universally in being, and to do that means to particularize itself. So once again, it just as it does have being in itself, it also has being for another, which is to say, just as it does have its own existence, it also has relational existence. Furthermore, in the particular aspect, well, you only know that particular is particular by the very fact that it's a reflection of something greater than itself, a universal, which it is a particular of. Um, so the two necessitate one another. And that's why, Hegel is saying, universal and particular are one, so to speak. They're imminently tied together. They don't exist in two separate worlds. They're one with each other. And you could even take this to a further degree, that like particularity as such is a universal, but it's in being a specific universal, it is a particular universal, and so it's this. The logic is it flips, but it's still there, no matter which way you look at it, and hence necessarily they necessarily imply one another. But I don't want to get too off track in like the logical sort of outdrawing of this. But anyway, in the attempt of consciousness to now raise itself from identification with the changeable to the unchangeable or unessential to essential, it is through this movement that it once again, as it did in the changeable, finds its individuality in the unchangeable, which means that it never captured its universal essence as such, but only another form of itself as static. However, the truth of this movement is the unity of the duality between the split of the unhappy consciousness. The truth of this unity divides itself into three. One, it finds itself confronted with individuality again, and not the full essence of itself as such, and is some sense at the start of the struggle. Two, secondly, it realizes that the universal, unchangeable, or essential aspect has individuality proper to it, and it is the essence of itself to express itself as this movement of itself in individual form. Another example of universal and individual being immanently present and directly reflecting one another. And lastly, three, this truth of its individuality being proper to the unchangeable is found to be the truth of the true nature of the dual nature of consciousness. What was first against it is now seen to be one with it, and its necessary mode of expression as its essence. Spirit takes joy in finding its unity in its manifold expression or individuation of its unchangeable essence in contingent form, which is to be superseded. And this supersession of the contingent shapes of consciousness as a process is the essence and thereby necessary, or therefore necessary. It is the contingent expressions of necessary being, which necessarily express itself in contingent shapes, which are contingent upon this necessary nature of itself. This is the unity of the universal and individual, the essential and unessential, and the truth of the unessential having its nature of unessentiality. For the movement of the essential, and is therefore, in some sense, part of the essential whole of consciousness. So there's a lot going on here. First of all, before I get into this part, I want to go back just a little bit. When consciousness tries to sort of abstract that unchangeable, essential aspect of itself, its unity of self through time. For a moment, it thinks it's grasped its essence, but it's wrong to think it's sort of wrong to think it has done that, because in abstracting it, in particularizing it, you sort of just do what the unchangeable has been doing the whole time, because the idea of the essence as such is not the same thing as the reality of it. It's sort of like saying, the absolute or being as such, right? In saying that, the concept is not the same thing as the actual true reality of it. You are, in doing that, in calling it the unchangeable universal, so to speak, you are particularizing it and turning it into something that it isn't. And it's kind of just sort of another particularization of the universal. And it's a mistake or a fallacy, so to speak, to conflate those two things, just as it would be a fallacy to conflate existence or being as such with actual being as such, right? So it's Hegel saying, look out for that. But another thing here is, he's divided this into three moments. The third one is interesting because I'm just going to read this again. I think it's kind of important to just go over this part again. Lastly, this is part three. Lastly, this truth of its individuality and being proper to the unchangeable is found to be the truth of the true nature of the dual nature of consciousness. What was first against it is now seen to be one with it, and its necessary mode of expression as its essence. So basically what that means is that the unchangeable and the changeable, or the essential and unessential, or the universal in particular, are sort of seen to be necessarily related to one another. And before, the first one was sort of the first discrepancy of putting emphasis on the essential, Uh, and the second is basically putting emphasis on the uh, the essential. Um, so keep that in mind. And there's a sentence here that I have that seems like a mouthful, seems a little complicated, but it's actually quite simple. Um, and I'm going to read it. Just going to keep reading this and sort of break it down more. Spirit takes joy in finding its unity in its manifold expression of or individuation of its unchangeable essence in contingent form, which is to be superseded. And this supersession of the contingent shapes of consciousness, that is, the instantiations of self, as a process, is the essence and therefore necessary. It is the contingent expressions of necessary being, which necessarily expresses itself in contingent shapes, which are contingent upon this necessary nature of itself. So that, what does that mean? Basically, necessity also implies contingency, right? Because for something to be necessary, it is only known to be necessary if there are things which are related to it that are not necessary. And the sort of, so for the unchangeable or the essential or the necessary um, essence of the self, it necessarily, meaning part of its essence or the nature of its essence, so to speak, is to express itself in contingent form and to supersede those contingent expressions. Uh, I suppose it's like another way of looking at it is like, well, it might not need to be this particular, but it will always be present in a particular necessarily. And that's sort of what Hegel's getting at here, that it's necessarily the case that necessity expresses itself in contingent form, through which its necessity is active and real. And the two imply one another. I guess you could also look at it like this, right? Take for instance, let's say somebody named John, right? So John doesn't necessarily have to exist, logically speaking. He came into the world by chance, or well, whatever. Whether or not chance is real is a different question. But he came into this world by contingent chance, so to speak. But there is a necessary aspect about John. It's necessarily the case that John is John and not anything else. So even in his contingency, there is an element of necessity present. So wherever you find a contingent thing, you will also find a necessary thing. It's kind of similar to how Aristotle said that order or chaos implies order, and vice versa. These two things sort of refer to one another. If you take pure chaos, so to speak, well, in chaos as such and having identity, it has an order to it, something intelligible about it. And for order to be order, well, I know something is ordered because it is not, disordered or lacking in identity. It's positively something. Well, to understand that means to also understand chaos in some sense as well. Now that truth might not be immediately present, but it's logically present is the point. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at with this. So this is sort of the movement within the unhappy consciousness. This movement of this movement is the resolution of the wretchedness of unhappy consciousness. The unchangeable essence expresses its nature through its movement in the individual, which was at first juxtaposed to the unchangeable movement of self versus the self as such or form. The movement of the individual, since it is one with the universal, is therefore just as much the movement of the universal or unchangeable. The movement's history is as follows. The individual or unessential element, changeable or self that moves through moments, is identified with, and the universal, which is seen as the essential element, is seen as alien to it. The unhappy consciousness seeks to unify the two, and therefore, in its raising of itself away from the unessential individual or the moving self toward the universal unchangeable form of the self, it then is known as itself also an individual in the sense that it is particular universe in the sense that its particular universal nature of a self that doesn't change is juxtaposed to the moving self or its own expression, and is in that sense circumscribed and distinct, making it a particular or individual by virtue of its own distinct nature of universality. Particulars are distinct in essence, but so too is the universal, and therefore they are one and find their mediation in the individual concrete expression. Finally, the two are taken to be one with each other. The universal or unchangeable self must be in order for it to express in the plethora of selves which manifest as that changeable unessential essence, distinct from the self as such, which must exist for this to occur. However, it is necessary that the self must express itself in this manifold expression, as to be universal is to be that which expresses itself as particularity. Universal is the unity which is contrasted with the many, but the unity only exists insofar as it can be distinct from the many. So both necessitate each other. And the universal in itself is a kind of particular, in that it is particularly universal. Thus, the unessential and essential, the changeable and the unchangeable are one with each other. The unchangeable is only so by virtue of the fact that there is something which itself changes. And to have change, something must remain the same so that it can be the case, we can say points are distinct from each other. But they are only distinct insofar as they remain what they are in relation to their difference. Hence, sameness and difference entail one another and are one with each other. A broader metaphysical point made outside the text on my part here. I just wanted to qualify that, but it is extremely relevant to this. So, but this is also here. This is a very important point that we're going to be coming up on now. This is sort of like, once again, Hegel. At this point, it feels like, oh, great, now we have a resolution to this problem he introduced us to, but it's actually not. We're going to run into another problem now. But to say this unity is fully understood is premature, and the truth is that the necessary relation between the essential and unessential, or unchangeable and changeable, is resolved in the sense that the unity is felt or intuited would be incorrect. The universal becoming individual is only known as a truth, but nonetheless, the experience of self-consciousness is still experiencing itself through manifoldness. In the world of time and space, where it loses itself but always reappears. This is the role of the unchangeable essence, rearing its head through the change of the self, which distinguishes itself from itself. But still, the multiple selves which share the same essence as distinct from one another in the sense that they exist differently at different points. So whilst this relation is necessary, the knowing of the truth that the unchangeable is also individual is contingent, but nonetheless brought on contingently by the necessary relation and nature of both elements within the duality of the unhappy consciousness. Therefore, the desire to negate this antithesis or interjuxtaposition will always remain a hope, since the very nature of experience for consciousness is this division between the changeable and unchangeable. So Hegel is saying that, even though we can understand at this point the logical distinction present between the essential and unessential, but how they're actually both essential in the sense that they both necessitate each other. And that, okay, so we can reason our way to saying, well, yes, I may manifest, I may exist through a plethora of moments, manifoldness, but in saying that, the I that exists through multiple stages is still an I that exists out beyond each particular stage. So there is a unity of selfness or I-ness there. And they imply one another, right? That's logically understandable. But despite that, the concrete experience isn't that. It's still the same as it always was. It's still this alienation from that unity of self beyond all the moments it supersedes. So we're still, like, in a certain sense, phenomenologically, if you will, alienated from the sort of pure, unchangeable self, because that's not what concrete reality is. But so that's why it's premature to say that the issue has been resolved, because in a certain sense, the very fact that we know this relation between the essential and unessential, and that they necessarily entail one another, that's fine. That's all, fine and good. But The fact that there is a relation means there is a distinction, means there is a discrepancy to some extent, or at least a separation between the two, I should say, that is still felt concretely, that still alienates us, at least phenomenologically, or in other words, in experience. Uh, the distinction between the abstract unchangeable essential and the concrete changeable unessential, although remains as such a principle, must be understood to be imminently one with each other. The self is there concretely always with its change, or in concrete expression. Rather, the self is always the same insofar as it is always the same self that is moving, and this moving and repelling of itself from itself is its concrete reality. Right? It's pretty much exactly what I was just saying before. Concrete reality in the world, which is its individual expression across many distinct points. This echoes the force and understanding section of sense certainty in the sense that there is a real distinction between the universal qualities or the matters of the object. And by the way, for those that don't recall, the matters is just the qualia of the object, uh, which having being for the object just as much as there is a truth to the reality of the mediated unified object. The former unessential, the latter essential, but both are in some sense essential and relationally so. We see that the unchangeable has being for the changeable, concrete self expressed as an individual, and that is where it finds its own mediation, and that the changeable needs the existence of the unchangeable to be the basis through which this movement between self-same points can occur and be distinct from one another. The points must be self-same, so that way distinction between them is possible, which is another way of saying that sameness allows for change, and that change can only occur between already existing things distinct from one another, because change is the movement away from one to another, and this movement away from one must be a movement away from a thing with unity of identity, in order that it can be said, quote, this was moved away from. If not, then there would not be nothing that could be said to be moved away from, hence the logical necessity of both. So in a certain respect, like if the self is repelling itself from itself in concrete reality, right? If it's saying, John on Monday, John on Tuesday, John on Wednesday, etc., uh, in the moving of itself away from itself to itself in another instance, that logically necessitates a unity of self, which is the logical entailment of the unchangeable or the essential, and that's how you could sort of deduce from the concrete reality the sort of abstract reality of the essential being present in this movement. Um, so that's kind of what he's getting at there, or that is what he's getting at there. The nature of this attempt to obtain oneness is threefold. One, as a pure consciousness or unchangeable essence. Two, as an incarnate or concrete individual who sees himself exist through a plethora of experience and finds himself in desire and work. And lastly, as a being which has its own being for self, or is being self contained and therefore one. The unchangeable consciousness is taken as an object of knowing for self consciousness, and because it is not yet the concrete incarnate consciousness and known through its expression and change, it is one sided and not understood as mediated. So, since this is the case, and since it is not known in and through its concrete expression, which is the work of itself, it is imperfect, and the labor of thinking still has work to do. So, in this part, he's kind of hearkening back to the earlier section of how, in work we can sort of see ourselves, but it still, still doesn't bring us, in the permanent object, so to speak, it doesn't really bring us back to the full unchangeable essence, of course, because, we work throughout our lives, right? And every piece of work is distinct from every other piece of work, but nonetheless, we see ourselves in all those distinct works. But there's still more room to be made for this in terms of understanding the essential, so to speak. So, in its second movement, it has advanced past Stoic thought, or the passive denial of individuality or otherness, and also skepticism, which was ceaseless contradiction and movement. And now it does take something to be stable among the unstable, the essential, unchangeable I. It holds together the notion of consciousness as such, and its expression through manifold points or individuated and distinct points from another, which maintain the essence of the self beyond them. This is the division present in unhappy consciousness. However, it has not yet developed the understanding of the unity of the two with one another and their implicit being which is found in each other. Instead, it maintains this underdeveloped intermediary position. The unity of pure thought, of consciousness as such, with its expression in individual or distinct form. It knows itself as such as the pure thinking form of the unchangeable universal, which is also distinctly individual as such, and also expresses itself individually. What it doesn't yet understand is that the unchangeable, which it knows as one through its manifold expression, is itself a single one or a single individual of consciousness as such, which is distinct from its various forms, which, in its nature as being distinct from them, is itself an individual. The unity of both individual and particular is seen again, but in the form of the universal as such, being known as a distinct universal from other universals, and therefore an individuated universal. It does not know explicitly that this is its object, even though it is implied in the as suchness of the individuality, or the unchangeable present in the manifold expression. So a subtle distinction, but the latter is the raising or bringing to light of the truth implied in the former intermediary position. So basically, in knowing that it does have an unchangeable aspect of itself, uh, it once again sort of becomes its own object, so to speak. But and because like, even any universal, right, is also a particular in the sense that there are distinct universals. Blue is a universal, red is a universal. They're both distinct from each other, making them two distinct particular universals. Uh, and the same thing is present here. Um, we have the individual expression of the universal self of a particular person uh, through time and space, but and so we can understand the individual expressions, but then there's also the individual person as well that is also universal, right? Like me, I'm a particular person. Snout is a particular person, but there's also like a universal aspect to ourselves, which is present in our entire life through our plethora of existence in time and space. But once we know this sort of individuality, we take it as our own object, so to speak, and we're doing this weird sort of oscillation again, where we have like, oh, okay, well, I am universal, but I'm also particular. My universality is particular, and that is also my own object. But this isn't. I don't really realize this yet. That's what he's sort of hinting at or saying here, rather. Um, in the first movement, where consciousness takes its unchangeable aspect as the true and universal, it is not truly grasped its essence as such in notional form, but only it has an object of thought. It merely recognizes it, but does not understand its nature fully. So it is therefore, its nature fully. So it is therefore devotion or directionless thinking that Hegel calls the jingling of bells. It is implied in individual form because it is only raised to object of thought and not yet notion. It is seen as alien or something outside the subject, hence the prior identification with the unessential aspect, which is concrete immediate being for consciousness. It recognizes or feels the infinite being of the unchangeable that is present across all distinct moments, but does not raise it to notion or objective thinking. We are left here with a pure yearning and the desire to unify this split between the unchangeable and changeable aspect. Consciousness wants the object, unchangeable essence, to be grasped and recognized, but it cannot. The unchangeable wants to be grasped as an individuality and be recognized in the thinking or living consciousness of the changeable, unessential, concrete existence of consciousness. But it cannot, because when attempted to be grasped, it is already gone, and its nature of individuality and particular expression is to be superseded by the other, which limits its individual, making them individual. And since it is always being superseded, its individual as such nature is also never grasped. And what is grasped is instead an image of it or the grave it has left for itself, which no longer exists in actuality and instead replaced by another concrete expression of the same individuality at a different point across its movement. So, what he's saying here is that anytime we try to grasp the the self as such, we end up abstracting it, and in abstracting it, we're sort of referring back to this self that's been superseded, is does no longer exist in concrete reality or immediacy, because it's sort of been negated through time. That's sort of the gray that we're referring to. In referring to the self, in the act of abstracting it, you are sort of holding up the dead corpse that's been transcended into or transcended by time now. Um, and it's almost like, for an analogy, I suppose it's like running on a hamster wheel thinking you're going somewhere, but you're not. Uh, and that's sort of what's happening to the unhappy consciousness. It's saying, oh, well, this is my individuality and this is what I am. But in saying that, it's already passed through time. It's in the past. It's gone. Doesn't exist anymore in actual expression. And it's just you're now just referencing a dead, non-moving thing at that point, and you haven't actually gotten to the bottom of what you are. Um, right? Like just think of yourself as a person. Well, my thought of me isn't the same thing as my actual reality, right? So that's what he's talking about. But the underlying essence behind each point of the movement, wait, no, I think I read that already. Uh, no, I didn't. But the underlying essence behind each point of the movement is never grasped, only the expression left behind, which is distinct from itself as such. Whenever we think we have grasped it in that moment, the moment has vanished, and so too its expression there concretely. Whenever consciousness tries to grasp itself, it collapses back into the antithesis that the as such it has grasped is a for itself and not the in itself, which is to say that it is merely a reflection of itself within itself, but not really the self as such that is behind its own reflection. Thus, in the end, since the self as such is always the beyond of the individuality of its own expression, it can never be grasped as such. Thus, what is grasped is an object of itself, which can only ever be led to the truth once it is taken as notion, which means it has an inner logic that is to be pushed through to unite its object back to substance. In other words, when that which perceives itself, it is not itself as such, but a reflection um, of itself as its own content, and therefore, the distinction between what is being perceived and the perceiver still remains, even if that perception is a perception of itself. The subject object distinction is always present, and therefore the true unification by this means is an impossible endeavor. Hegel says that this is not a true universal individuality in the form of thought, which means it is not an individual thought which signals or leads to the recognition of universal truth as such, or notional thought. In the end, this struggle will lead consciousness to quit this endeavor of trying to grasp itself in this manner of unchangeable individuality. And when it understands that the actuality of its grave of existence, or in other words, its moving nature of self sublation, loses its actuality when grasped, since it has been superseded, because the individual as such is not the same as it is when expressed, because it is posterior to that expression. It will then quit searching for the unchangeable individuality, because it is always returned to that antithesis where the true individuality as such is never grasped, but only its reflection as an object. And in being a reflection, it is distinct from the thing that has been reflected. It is only then that it will begin looking elsewhere, namely, in looking to find itself as inherently one and unfolding as its essence, that its true nature will be understood. In the first instance of the unhappy consciousness, it feels itself through returning to itself and feeling the certainty of itself, or in other words, becoming its own object. With the fact of its own certainty, which is its knowledge of its individuality, it can now see itself in relation to independent objects outside itself, and namely, it knows this via desire and work. But since its experience of itself is fleeting, it is always divorced from itself as such, or the unchangeable essential aspect of itself, and thus is separated from its ideal form of itself, which can never fully bridge the gap between at this stage. It does not yet understand that the very fact that it can see itself in and through its own work and enjoyment is thus the very fact of its own existence of self, that is, through the movement of itself and its own work, the certainty of its own individual essence. So basically, in a sense, consciousness becomes so uh, distraught trying to bridge this gap. Even though it knows logically that you know it does have a unity of self, it doesn't know that it's not meant to be approached the way that certain concrete things are approached, because its nature isn't to be concrete as such, but only to express itself through concrete reality. It's having a hard time understanding this. Um, and so at that point, it's beginning to quit this attempt at trying to bridge this gap in the way it wants to. It's sort of bridging the gap in the wrong way, so to speak, because there is a legitimate way to bridge this gap, which we'll see, but this isn't the way to do it. Let me see if there's anything else I should mention here. Well, yeah, I guess I should talk a little bit about the like prior to this, it's sort of like last almost pathetic attempt is to sort of particularize the universal self as its own object, saying, okay, well, like for instance, in saying, well, there's my unchangeable self that exists. It's like that's true, but in predicating it like that, you're then particularizing it, making it this sort of thing that exists as an idea and not the thing as such, and you sort of make it a superficial thing, and it's not actually getting you to where you want to go. You're kind of propping up this reflection of the truth, but not the actual truth itself. And you're making the mistake of conflating those two things. It's sort of like it would be like saying, well, here's an analogy. You look in a mirror, right? You see your true self in that mirror, but then to say the mirror reflection is the same thing as that which is being reflected would be a mistake. That's kind of what consciousness is doing when it tries to grasp the unchangeable essential aspect of itself as a particular thing that it can experience in immediacy. It ends up just being a reflection of that and not actually that as such, which is, it'd actually be more accurate or more in line with reality to sort of just identify with the what was considered the unessential concrete expression through time, because that is the actualized, I should say, expression of that unchangeable self. So that also, I just wanted to clarify that a little bit more in case it wasn't clear. But yeah, it's going to eventually sort of get too distraught with this, because it's going to realize, well, okay, no matter what I do, I can't get that the way I want it. All I can just get is indirect references to his true reality, whether it be through my labor, through which I see my own independence, or whether it be through my concrete sort of sense of self, through which I see my own independence, or whether it be through the recognition of myself and others, in which I see my own independence. But even there, like that's still the concrete contingent self that is being recognized in a certain way. But also, because you are recognizing the contingent self, you are also recognizing the necessary self, or the essential self, through which has its contingent aspect. But it's still not exactly what this unhappy consciousness really desires. But okay, so moving on here. Thus, it is said that this world of desire and work of the unhappy consciousness is the sanctification or the fulfillment of the unchangeable self, which as universal or ideal self necessarily expresses itself in moments and in concrete actuality. As universal, it can only be universal if it is that essence which is beyond all plurality, and is therefore the unity of self, which is only known as such through its expression into the many individuations of itself. It is not truly universal. It expresses itself in these moments, since to be universal is by definition to be that which is the beyond or the grounding of all particulars. Right. So any one particular self that is superseded isn't the same thing as a universal, even though it implies it and is one with it. So let's see here. If consciousness were aware of its being in itself, or simply put, independent being, then, in relation to the world of actuality, and specifically in the independent world experienced through work and enjoyment, it would view this world as null and simply reaffirm its own independence in the face of this nullity. However, since consciousness is concretely one with this world and experience of itself as actual, which is seen in work and enjoyment, it cannot relinquish it. The world of actual concrete consciousness, which is felt and known through change, is the expression or form of the unchangeable itself. This produces a split relation internally within consciousness, which is the being for self of its own in itself, which is to say this. In work and enjoyment, it is for itself. It is the unchangeable self expressed through its labor, but in doing so, it becomes its own object. But this object is not merely abstract, but has concrete actuality and is the concrete expression of that unchangeable essence, which is its being in itself. This is the unchangeable granting itself through particularity for consciousness. In other words, it is gifting itself as a for itself for consciousness. And therefore, in its expression, concretely, is allowing itself to be related back to itself. The unchangeable is gifting itself to consciousness by its expression of itself as it moves through actuality, as consciousness, as is its nature, and this is how it can know itself and make use of itself. So this is an interesting point here. Gifting, right? And this is all personification in a way. It's not like a willing necessarily, but it's Hegel is saying that the unchangeable, by its own very nature of expressing itself in particularity, is also allows the particular active selves through concrete reality to externalize themselves through work, for instance. And in doing that, it allows you to see the unchangeable I that's present in all your work, right? And this is sort of like the unchangeable self, if you will, saying, look, here's the truth of your independence and myself that I'm allowing you to know through your own self-expression, which is also the expression of me, which is also the expression of you, because they're the same in a certain respect. So it's almost a threefold thing, right? You have the unchangeable self, right, which is necessary for the particular plethora of self-expression of that one self. But in that concrete reality, since the self is active, it can express itself through its creation of objects, through work and enjoyment. But in doing so, it sees in its own creation, its own independence, its own unity of self, which is sort of the realization of its unchangeable essence, its I-ness as such. And that is the gifting of the unchangeable to itself in a certain sense. Gifting, I guess, you could call it a gift because it's sort of allowing itself to be referred to in a certain sense through its own self-perception, right? Like to give a concrete example, if I were to build a chair, right, I would say, okay, well, I built that chair, but in me being the I that built that chair in this particular moment, I am also simultaneously recognizing that there is an I that did that work, that is ultimately an I that transcends this particular instance of labor and this particular instance or moment as such. And because that's the case, that is the unchangeable that I am looking into. And that's what he's talking about. That is the sort of gift, right, that he's speaking of. It's sort of granting itself over to itself in that respect. Another relation is present within consciousness. Hegel refers to this as the passive and active extremes of actuality. The passive is merely the distinction of itself as such, the plethora of selves that can be said to be concrete and can be reflected on. However, the active side is the living movement and repelling of itself from itself, which is the negation of itself into another actuality of itself. Taking one of these as their own is to make them superficial, and they work in tandem. So, yeah, you can't have one without the other. The passive side must exist in order for there to be something that is moved to and from. If movement between points is occurring, the passive points must be there to be moved through logically. But this existence of points as such is the very movement and expression of this unchangeable essence, which in its nature expresses itself as universal. Consciousness for now does not know that this is its self-externalization of itself for itself, and for now sees this manifold expression as ceaseless as a ceaseless beyond of the unchangeable self. This is similar to bad infinity and not true self-contained infinity we saw spoken of at the end of sense certainty. So consciousness is still not really appreciating the fact that, well, my expression of myself is from myself. Ultimately, it lets me refer back to my own existence. What it really does is it kind of ignores that, and it just sees it as a sort of ceaseless beyond, um, which is doing itself a disservice not recognizing that. Because if it were to recognize that it was referencing back to itself, it would sort of show its own self-contained existence. Um, so, and so on that passive active distinction, let's go over that just one more time to make it clear. The passive is merely the distinction of itself as such. Uh, the plethora of selves, right? It's just, the fact that you just as an individual exist through time, right? That's not your own action. That's just your sort of, if we want to get Heideggerian with it, your sort of phenomenological thrownness too, in a certain sense, the fact that you're just sort of like thrust in this existence through temporality. That's the passive sort of expression of the unchangeable self. Uh, but and the passive must exist in order for there to be something that is moved to and from, right? Because you can't move from yourself to yourself if you don't exist in multiple different points. Uh, let's see, and that of course points to the expression of the unchangeable, which must exist as the precondition for that process. But the active side is the actual, the sort of labor of that passive expression, so to speak. So like there's a passive you that's instantiated, but then the active aspect of that passivity is you doing the labor through which you can recognize yourself, so to speak. Let's see if there's anything else I missed here. Oh, okay, so that's pretty clear. The fact that the unchangeable surrenders itself in the sense that it expresses itself in change, and the fact that the changeable living consciousness refuses to identify with itself and sees itself as dependent on this unchangeable is in some sense a recognition of the unity of the two. However, in recognizing the relation, so too is the divide recognized. Relations require divisions between terms. And thus, by virtue of this recognition, between both and their necessary relation, the divide is also reinforced once more, and the unhappy consciousness finds itself still feeling alienated by virtue of another developed form of its recognition of this divide. Even though consciousness, in the individual aspect of itself, sees itself as less than or inferior to the unchangeable, it in its giving of thanks to it, and thus uh, denies itself satisfaction, it does in some sense allow itself satisfaction in the fact that it is satisfied through its own active recognition of the unchangeable. In saying, I am the product of the unchangeable, it not only recognizes the unchangeable, but also itself, therefore, has in some respect allowed itself satisfaction, as Hegel notes. Hegel also knows that it recognizes its individual nature as well in work and desire and satisfaction. All of these imply its individuating nature. It is in this sense, in the fact that it takes itself to be unessential or lesser than the essential and derivative of it, that it then also allows itself a sort of true independent existence as that which is lesser as such. The truth here is paradoxical. In its denial of self, in the sense that it is not absolute, it actually affirms itself as a necessary and distinct relation of the absolute, and therefore having its own independent being, similar to the bondsman moving beyond his own contingent sense of self and recognizing his own independence. So that's also another slight paradox that we should point out here. In the sort of in saying that, well, my unessential aspect is lesser than the changeable or essential aspect. It's kind of also recognizing its own independence by virtue of understanding this relation. Um, which is, similar to other things we've seen throughout this chapter and prior. Uh, but in denying its particularity is not absolute, because its particularity is ultimately referencing a universal. It's also taking itself to have some sort of absoluteness in a sense. So it's weird. It seems contradictory, but it's not. It's a paradox in saying that, well, I am lesser in relation to this aspect of myself that is not lesser. Uh, it is simultaneously saying it has both of these aspects proper to the self as such. Um, so Hegel brings to light the third relation of self consciousness. Here, it shows its consequences in depth. In the first, we saw the self consciousness of pure unhappiness, uh, in that it has not yet known his independence in the face of his concrete reality, in the changeable, and yearning for the unchangeable, but he has not seen his essence in that work and enjoyment. The second relationship is its knowledge of its independence made real and actual through work and enjoyment, which stems from that desire latent in the unhappy first relation or feeling of first alienation. This leads to the work and enjoyment therein as the active externality of the concrete individual, so that way he has a window into his independence. Through this and the recognition he has seen his independence, and in seeing this, he knows he's not merely an abstract, unchangeable, but has concrete existence in actuality. It is in that actual expression he knows his unity, his unchangeable must really be, and through the other has returned into himself. In this return into itself, it is again faced with the enemy. Through the acknowledgement of its own independence, which was found in the other, it returns into itself as the knowing of itself having unity, and is again that recognition of the unchangeable. But here, in this recognition of the unchangeable, it forgets its concrete presence in the actual and cancels it out after getting confirmation of its independent existence as such. So, once again, it's trying to hug onto this unchangeable aspect of itself, and sort of saying, okay, well, I know logically at a higher level now, my own sort of unchangeable essential aspect of myself, and I'm going to well, all right, now this is going to allow me to sort of deny the unessential aspect and consider it unessential and lesser, um, and I'm gonna and that's why Hegel refers to it as the enemy, so to speak, because that's how it views its sort of a manifold particular expression in concrete reality. It's like, well, this is a problem for me because it's getting in the way of what I want to get to, which is my essential uh, perfect form, so to speak. Uh, and but once it sort of understands that it's you know that essential aspect of itself manifests itself in particularity, and then it can seize independence through its work and enjoyment and satisfaction. Oh, and then it returns back to itself. It then once again tries to cut that off, even though that would be, in a certain sense, very idiotic, because that's the thing that actually allowed it to get to that point. And also, it's the very nature of that essential aspects sort of being for another, the way in which its essence truly exists as a real thing is to do that. It's active, but it doesn't see this yet. It doesn't want to look at that. It wants to push that away because it so desperately wants to latch on to this unity of self, pure self, um, so to speak. It's unrelenting at this point once again. So the third relationship is the relation where concrete actuality, or the changeable as actual, is related to the universal being, unchangeable, but as a seeming nothing or thing which cannot be grasped, but truly is a real term. This is the naught and null and the antagonism of the unhappy consciousness present once more. The taking of this actuality of the unchangeable to be in its intangible grasping as such, in actuality as its nullity, present as the nothingness of the changeable, even though consciousness logically knows its existence in the being for another of it, it has expressed in that uh, concrete expression of the individual, it still, after everything, has difficulty confronting its unity fully. The difference of the third from the first and the second is that it knows the unchangeable is actual, but it still feels this alienation from it and its inability to harness it. but it can only harness it in understanding the relation through the individual as the mediation. But it tries to do this understanding of the universal unchangeable by denying the individual or changeable as a nothingness in the face of the universal. But this only alienates it from the universal again. It takes its supersession of the individual as a nothingness, but this treatment of it as such commits suicide of the unchangeable, since its essence is to mediate as individual truly. It is unrelenting here in the third as it was in the first and second, in desiring to capture the universal as such. Instead of trying to capture from the first side of knowing, it must be, but is distinct from its concrete existence as what was its unessential individuality. It now denies the unessential in a more mature way, mature but albeit wrong, in saying that the unessential is a nothingness again, but from the standpoint now of its return from it back to the essential. In the first, it takes the essential unchangeable as true. Through the recognition of its alienation, it sees itself, for example, as relating to a term as real, but cannot grasp its reality, but knows its own essence as an alienated individual. But in three, it knows it as true from its movement of itself. So in the second, which is his truth, uh, but now denies its very movement as necessary, even though it allowed it to return back to the truth of the unchangeable. The thanks it gave has now become ungrateful in a sense, in its canceling out of its work and its focus on it, focus on the universal from which it stemmed. Inherent to relation three is its undermining of the truth of two, but if so, then three cannot truly be. In two, uh, it is what demonstrates the independence, but in doing so, in three, the means through which the independence can be distinction is denied, if so. So then is its unchangeableness, which is itself as universal individual. One alienates itself from the universal in its focus on the concrete reality, seemingly divorced from that of the unchangeable universal, yet it still, in its unhappiness, needs it. Three alienates itself from the universal in that it returns, uh, in that in its return to it, it denies its self-expression as null. But doing this, it denies its essence as universal, which is this alienation present from another side. And as soon as it thinks it has grasped in its return, it has lost it. So essentially, what is going on here is that we get this. At first, we have the identification with the unessential aspect because it's the immediate concrete expression. It feels alienated from its universality, right? Its essentiality. It then tries to bridge this gap, but it can't do that fully. But then it begins to do this when it realizes the two necessitate each other, and that truth is fully recognized in its work and satisfaction. Uh, because through the work, it can see itself, its true unity of self through the work, which is distinct from itself. That is the sort of the unchangeable uh, granting itself through the changeable, so to speak. It's, as I said before, the unchangeable is the condition which allows the self-expression of the self in the particular moments of its concrete actuality. And when that happens, when you create something, you see, oh, I did that. But in saying I did that, that's implying the existence of an I-ness as such. Aha, therefore, I've pointed back to my unchangeable unity of self. And then once that's realized in the third relation, it's once again sort of thinks it grasped itself and it wants to push away from that again. It's saying, well, okay, well, I don't really care about the work and enjoyment now. I just care that I can get back to the essentiality. But that's becoming ungrateful in a certain sense. Ungrateful in the sense that it's now denying the conditions through which it was able to actually see its essentiality. And logically speaking, in denying that sort of, or not caring about that sort of expression, you are denying the essence of that essentiality you're trying to get to, because the essence of that essentiality is to manifest itself in the particular form. It can't be universal without doing so. But so denying, in a weird way, in your affirmation as the universal, as this thing alienated from the particular or superior to the particular, you're actually undermining the truth of the universal, because the truth of the universal is to manifest itself through particularity. So in denying its that other aspect, you end up denying what you're trying to affirm. And we saw that previously in two as well, in the second relation, where consciousness tried to sort of grasp the unessential, or sorry, the essential as a particular thing that it can speak of and predicate. But in doing so, it particularizes, and it just is a reflection of that essentiality and not the essentiality as such, which is what it thought it was. It's doing the same thing that it did in two, but in a much more mature sense, in the sense that it's recognizing it not as necessarily just the idea of it as such, but the idea of it from its concrete presence through its uh, expression in work, for example. It's doing it at a higher level. It's still wrong. It's still a discrepancy. It's still one-sided thinking, but it's a sort of more developed one-sided thinking, because now it's seeing it from another sort of angle instead of just in just the one angle of making it an idea or a reflection. It's seeing it as a concrete reflection now and taking from that its essence. Uh, what I mean by concrete reflection versus just an abstract reflection, thinking of, so there's a difference between realizing yourself through your work, which is a concrete thing. I made this chair. Okay, well, the I there is presupposed, and that reflection of myself is a concrete reflection in reality. Whereas the sort of abstract reflection is just me thinking of myself as such. That would be two. The latter would be three. Both end up being problematic because they both deny concreteness at a certain point. But three is obviously a much more developed form of that. So with that being said, I think I'm going to stop it here because this is getting a little much at this point. We will continue. So we have how many pages do we have left? There's like 5 pages left. So the next episode should probably be like an hour or less. Um, and yeah, we're making it through this section. So yeah, I know I talked a lot. I don't know if you have anything to add or say. I'll give you the final word.
Yes, well, I strategically kept quiet throughout almost the entire thing to get as quickly as possible through this.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Um,
But
all right.
hopefully I'll have more to say in the next episode. Whenever
Yeah.
that may be.
Well, I'm thinking Thursday because I'm going to be busy tomorrow. But we'll talk about that off air.
Yeah, by the way,